Welcome to the Single Pilot Resource Management module, Aeronautical Decision Making. In this module, we're also going to include workload management, task and automation management. Now, aeronautical decision making is a systematic approach to the mental process used by pilots to consistently determine the best course of action in response to a given set of circumstances. Events leading to a poor decision are normally cumulative. This is called the poor judgment chain or error chain. Now, breaking just one of these bad links can put us back on track. And also, like we talked about in other modules, asking the question, what if, over and over, may alert us to a weak link in that chain. Now, workload management that we're going to be discussing as well is most likely the most important of all in-flight items. A single pilot in command of an aircraft must organize workload so that in an abnormal situation, they don't get overwhelmed and make the wrong decisions. Task management, in conjunction with workload management, creating a flow of tasks that becomes second nature, will avert distractions, emotional overload, and improper decisions during high-stress conditions. And automation management. With the inclusion of a myriad of electronics in the cockpits today, it's needed not only to completely know your system functions, but to have an alternative plan in place should one of those electronics either malfunction or not do what you expected them to do. Now, we're going to start off by discussing several accidents so you can sort of think about the chain of events that happened and what you would have done in this situation. Now, granted, most of these are two-pilot operations. Doesn't matter. Whatever happened in this cockpit, you can also apply the same information to single-pilot flights. Now, keep in mind the workload, the task management, the automation, and proper decision-making. We're going to discuss this highly critiqued crash. You've probably all heard about it. You've probably all discussed it. You probably all know exactly what went wrong. But there are things that you may not be aware of, and we're going to go through them so that you can actually be apprised of what you would have done in this situation and what you could do in future flights to avoid any kind of situation like this. Now, breaking just one of the chain of events in this whole flight may have alerted the crew to their deteriorating situation. So I'm just going to go over the accident here a little bit so that we can all be on the same page. Now, the background information on the pilots: during his various first check rides, the captain was disapproved for his instrument airplane rating, his commercial multi-engine, his airline transport certificate, and received unsatisfactory grades on not only his recurrency proficiency, but his upgrade proficiency check in the Saab 340. And Colgan's flight records indicated that the first officer had accumulated 2,200 hours of total flying time, including almost 800 hours in turbine airplanes. But she had never flown in icing conditions until recently. Now, each pilot made an inappropriate decision to use the crew room to obtain rest before the accident. During the 24 hours that preceded this, the first officer was reported to have slept 3.5 hours on a flight because she had to commute from the West Coast, and 5.5 hours in the crew room. The captain had experienced chronic sleep loss, and both he and the first officer had experienced interrupted and poor quality sleep during the 24 hours before the accident. In addition, the first officer was sick with a cold. Now, the METARs at 2154, which is obviously dark, indicated that the winds were from 240 at 15 knots, gusting to 22. Visibility was 3 miles in light snow and mist, a few clouds at 1,100 feet, broken ceiling at 2,100, and overcast of 2,700. The temperature was 1 degree, and the dew point was a -1. Now, I remember that night because I was sitting comfy in my house and I was saying, gee, I'm glad I'm not going to be flying that night because it was howling and the weather was really, really crummy. On February 12th, that was the date of this crash in 2009, the Colgan Air Bombardier DHC 8-400 crashed into residence in Clarence, New York, about 5 miles northeast of the Buffalo airport. Now, the NTSB determined that the probable cause of this accident was the captain's inappropriate response to the activation of the stick shaker, which led to an aerodynamic stall from which the airplane did not recover. And contributing to the accident were the flight crew's failure to monitor airspeed in relation to the rising position of the low-speed Q, the flight crew's failure to adhere to sterile cockpit procedures, the captain's failure to effectively manage the flight, and Colgan Air's inadequate procedures for airspeed selection and management during approaches and icing conditions. Now, this is what happened. First of all, the cockpit voice recorder showed that the pilots chit-chatted about non-flying topics from the time they got in the airplane, even before taxi, right up until just before the approach. En route, the captain replied that ice was present on his side of the windshield and asked whether ice was present on her windshield side. Well, an airplane usually doesn't decide whether you're going to have ice on the left side or the right side of the airplane, so this was kind of a strange comment. But the first officer responded, "Lots of ice." Then the captain stated, "That's the most I've seen on the leading edges in a long time." And then about 10 seconds later, the captain and the first officer began another conversation that was totally unrelated to the ice or the weather or the conditions. About 22:12, the approach controller cleared the flight crew to descend and maintain 2,300 feet. The first officer acknowledged the clearance, and afterwards the captain and the first officer performed their flight duties related to the approach, but also continued the conversation that was totally unrelated to their flying duties. Now, the approach controller then cleared the flight crew to turn left onto a heading to intercept the localizer for the approach to runway 23. The captain began to slow the airplane less than 3 miles from the outer marker. Now, the cockpit voice recorder recorded sounds similar to the landing gear handle deployment and the landing gear movement. And the FDR showed that the propeller conditions levers had been moved forward to their maximum RPM position. And then the pitch trim in the airplane went nose up, had been applied by the autopilot. And the ice detector messages appeared on the engine display in the cockpit. Hello, wouldn't you sort of pay attention to that? The flight data recorder data showed that the flaps had been selected to 10 degrees and the airspeed was about 135 knots. Now, at 22:16, the cockpit voice recorder recorded a sound similar to the stick shaker. It also recorded a sound similar to the autopilot disconnect horn, which repeated until the end of the recording. It also showed that when the autopilot disengaged, the airspeed was 131 knots, and engine power was increasing. Then the airplane pitched up, rolled to the left, angle of 45 degrees, then rolled back to the right. As the airplane rolled to the right through wings level, the stick pusher activated. They put the flaps up while the airspeed was down to about 100 knots. The data recorder also showed that the roll angle reached 105 right wing down degrees before the airplane began to roll back to the left and the stick pusher activated a second time. Now, the airplane's pitch and roll angles had reached about 25 degrees airplane nose down and 100 degrees right wing down, respectively, when the airplane entered a steep descent and the stick pusher activated a third time and they crashed. Now, if you read the full transcript of this voice recorder, there is no crew resource management. No discussion about conditions other than we have a lot of ice. No alternatives discussed. No discussion about the approach. No discussion about the speeds that they would have. No discussion about the landing distance with the snowy runway. But they had a lot of chit-chat about schedules, personal stuff throughout the entire flight from taxi just before they intercepted the ILS. There was no sterile cockpit until the last minute when the airplane became uncontrollable. So now if you think about this, there were chain link breakdowns. Scheduling adequate rest before the flight is the responsibility of, ask yourself this question, is it crew schedule's fault, is it the pilot's fault, or is it dispatch? What do you think? Obviously the pilot's. Now, you know, it's a little dicey here if you say I'm too tired to fly, call in sick, whatever. But you have to realize that no matter what happens in your job, you have the responsibility of all those people in your airplane. And if you're too tired and the weather's really crummy and it's going to make you have to really, really focus, you might think twice about taking that flight. So the ultimate responsibility, crew dispatch only schedule pilots as per duty time regulations. So you really have to be responsible to have enough rest and enough nourishment. Cat naps instead of good night's sleep do not help make good decisions on a night when you're dealing with extreme weather conditions. Doesn't matter whether you're in a 2-people airplane with 48 people in the back or whether you're in a 172 that has 4 people in it. But you just have to remember that this is the responsibility of the pilot and the pilot alone. Now, chain link breakdown 2. If a pilot encounters weather he or she is not confident to handle, they should turn around or change altitudes, communicate to center, cancel the trip, or meet the challenge and figure out as you go. Obviously, the last option should not be an option for you. You want to have an alternative plan before you take off. All right, you have to look and make sure that all your bricks are in a line. You have to make sure that you've gone through all the weather, you've gone through all the scenarios, you've discussed with the other pilot, if there is another pilot in your airplane, what you would do in every kind of situation that could happen on that flight. Then you will make, like I say, aeronautical decision making. This is proper. Then you can figure out, do you need to cancel the trip? If you're in the air and something happens, do you want to communicate to center and say, oops, I'm getting in a situation I can't handle, maybe we should go someplace else? Turn around, change altitudes. Before it gets critical, at the first sign of ice, they should have talked about absolutely nothing but their options and the amount of ice that they had and how it was going to affect the airplane performance. I was a pilot on a Hawker, and one time we went into Pontiac, Michigan. At night, and it was snowing, and, jets fly in snow. It's not a big deal, but for some reason, the conditions were just right that on approach, we went through what we thought was Niagara Falls. That airplane turned into an igloo instantly. And there were little snowballs around the windshield, which we've never seen before. So both of us realized that this could be a critical situation. So we quickly just discussed very quickly, okay, we're going to keep the speed up a little higher on final because we're going to, keep all the de-icing obviously was on, but we had a plan of action, and we did land hot, even though the runway was icy, but we already talked about what we would do once we got down. We didn't want to fall out of the sky because of the ice, so we discussed it, and that's what these people should have done. If you feel the weather's too dicey, you should absolutely get to your destination without incident. You should cancel the trip. There's nothing embarrassing about canceling the trip. You can always do it tomorrow. If you're dead, you can't. If you bump into weather en route, don't be a hero. Turn around and tell center why. If you do find yourself in a compromised situation, give your full attention on flying the airplane and then quickly decide upon options. But there's always the ego that refuses to admit you can't handle this situation and wants you to press forward. Make sure that isn't you. Okay, chain link breakdown 3. In a 2-pilot operation, communication in bad weather should be restricted to checklists and approach altitudes, cross-checking the flying pilot, proper call-outs, and any air deviation in aircraft attitude and airspeed. Absolutely. Sterile cockpit. If you've got bad weather, nothing else is more important than getting that airplane on the ground safely. And you must devote your entire attention to doing that. Check, recheck. If you have another pilot, ask them to help you. Give them a checklist. Even if they're not a pilot, if there's a passenger, have them read the checklist so that you can make sure that you don't miss something. Call things out loud. If you've got step-down altitudes, give them a call out loud. Make sure that you use the GUMP checklist if you've got a retractable airplane, before you land. Make sure that flying is your absolutely first priority. Sterile cockpit, even if you're single pilot. Sterile cockpit. Distractions can make the best aeronautical decisions go out the window. In a CRM or SPRM cockpit, Communication should be restricted only to that which concerns the flight. No chatting with passengers during critical phases of flight or emergencies. I don't care what they say. School them before you get in the airplane and tell them not to talk during the outlined phases of flight. Takeoff, landing, when we get up to, 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet, whatever you establish. Tell them that you will then tell them, okay, it's all right to chit-chat now, everything's under control. Okay, chain link breakdown 4. In a single pilot operation, communication in bad weather should include reading checklists. You can read them out loud. Approach frequencies, minimums, step-down altitudes. Tell your passengers, I'm going to read these out loud, unless you have someone who will actually give you the checklist and then you can read it out loud as a response. Tell your passengers to be quiet. Communicate with center and ask for assistance if you get overwhelmed. It's really, really important. I mean, people say, oh, I don't want to read it out loud, but sometimes reading out loud prevents you from skipping something. Our brain, if we're in a hurry, will go down the checklist and we'll just skip something and we won't know we skipped it. But if you read it out loud, you've addressed it. So it's a little important to do that, even though it may be kind of weird, to your passengers. Now, if you can't remember all sorts of acronyms and everything that you're supposed to do, what you really need to just say is, what if? We've talked about this in other modules. It's so simple. And on the way out, what would have happened if they had just said what if? From the time that they got in that airplane and they knew what the weather was, what if they had said what if all along the way? What if they gotten more rest before the flight? They could have asked themselves, what if? Am I fit to fly in these conditions? What if they talked to dispatch about the icing conditions? What if you end up talking to the FBO or you talk to flight service? Don't just go online and make your own decision. If there's icing conditions, call flight service and say, what are the reports? What do you think? They'll tell you what they think is happening. What if they could have talked to other pilots of dispatch about the freezing levels and operating in the ice? Yeah, talk to somebody. Find out someone who just came through it. When you get off the ground, call center and say, hey, are there any PIREPs? Has anybody been going through this? What are they finding? What if they kept a sterile cockpit on the climb and descent? Maybe they would have had their head a little bit less up and locked. What if they checked the weather en route? Did they check the weather en route? No. What if they asked for PIREPs about icing conditions? We don't know. According to the transcripts, they weren't the least bit concerned about the weather. These what-ifs should have all been asked long before they entered the weather condition. And think what you would have done if you flew this route often, okay? You go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's like, second nature, you know the frequencies by heart, you know what's to expect, the approaches by heart pretty much. The big inconsistencies are weather and mechanicals. Would you have looked for problems that make this flight different, or will you just worry about it when you get there? Complacency is a big deal. Do not get complacent. Force yourself to say something may be different on this flight that I fly all the time, so maybe I ought to look for it before it happens. Be ready. Discuss your options. Like again, there. What if they discussed the icing procedures for this aircraft? It was icing. They knew that before they took off. So why didn't they discuss it? The cockpit voice recorder had nothing about the flight. They never said, oh, geez, we might be getting into heavy ice here today. What do you do? Let's go to the AFM and see, what the icing procedures are. Let's look at the different stall characteristics. Let's make sure our airspeed stays higher. Whatever. Using crew resource techniques, what if they rechecked each checklist item, such as the speed bug setting? We never heard any of this. We never heard the co-pilot saying anything to the captain, about, hey, maybe the airspeed should be kept up a little higher. What if they'd taken the aircraft off of autopilot so they could feel what was happening with the ice loading? You get a feel that this airplane is getting real mushy. If it gets real mushy, hello, a little more airspeed. What if they saved the icing stories for fireside chat in the ground? Now you can do all of this as a single pilot. Doesn't matter that you have two pilots that are going to die in the airplane. You need just one smart pilot that can avoid these kinds of mistakes. To recap, stay focused on flying. If you're a single pilot, cross-check yourself. Be religious about checklists. Absolutely religious. How many of us know our airplane so well we do a short checklist? Well, my checklist in a Cherokee is like 4 pages long. Because I forget stuff, especially if I'm going to go IFR. Stay aware of any changes to the flight characteristics of the airplane. Monitor things all the way along. If you know you're going into dicey weather, make sure everything is working okay before you get in there, and know what your options and your alternatives are if something is a problem. Maintain the sterile cockpit by yourself. Doesn't matter if you're flying alone. Don't listen to the radio. Don't have all your charts done. Get your GPS set up. Don't do anything when you're on the critical phases of flight, but fly that airplane. Passengers, give them some task, like holding the approach plate if they're in the right seat. Anything to keep them quiet. You can think about other things that might have happened in this accident, but basically they weren't really flying the airplane. They were just riding out to Buffalo. Abide by the set of the rules that you create. You set these rules, okay? You know your airplane. You've been trained. You set a set of rules for each possible situation. How many of you have that? Probably not. You've gone to school, then you don't do anything again for 6 months. You go back to school again or whatever, and you forget. So you really need to have your own set of rules. Emergency conditions such as engine failure require an immediate response using established procedures. Review those often. Every time you fly, what if the engine quits? Ask yourself that when you're sitting going along being bored, and just go over the answers. If the subtler conditions that could go wrong in a flight are less apparent, have an answer for those before they happen. If one of the instruments starts going out, or if your pitot tube starts icing up. There's a lot of things, suppose the pitot heat fails and the pitot tube ices up, and then you're going to get erroneous instruments. Know what that's going to be. Review that constantly. Use a team approach, even if you're by yourself. That may alert you to a kink in your safety chain that could steer you in the wrong direction, but only if you are aware and you listen for them, which is why it's so important to do all this homework on the ground long before you get in the air. Now, the problem is perceived first by the senses, then through insight and experience. Now, once you are alerted, then you have to use your objectivity to analyze your options. But above everything, keep flying. Look at the situation in relation to the progress of the flight. Don't fixate on the problem and get distracted. Remember, fly the airplane, scan the problem, scan the instruments. Scan the problem, scan the instruments. Don't keep your head focused on the instruments, which is the next crash that we'll talk about after the break. Fly the airplane first. You've heard this a million times. We're just saying it again. Now, this is the end of part 1. Please take a break and then continue with part 2 of aeronautical decision making. Welcome back to part 2 of aeronautical decision making, task and automation, and workload management. Now, this is another stupid crash. That's what we call it, stupid crash, because it really didn't have to happen. You've probably all heard about this. At least the older pilots would have remembered this one. It happened in 1972, just after Christmas. A Lockheed 1011 TriStar departed 2 hours earlier from Kennedy Airport and was on approach into Miami. The flight was instructed to join the ILS localizer to runway 9 left, and turning onto final approach, the captain called the tower and said to the co-pilot to please lower the landing gear. Okay, now the landing gear didn't go down, or it didn't indicate down. So Eastern Airlines flew into the Everglades because of a failed light. All because the captain didn't employ aeronautical decision making to assign someone to fly the airplane. Now I'm going to read you a little bit about this flight so you can sort of see how no one was paying attention to the cardinal rule, fly the airplane first. All right, and when they're turning on to final approach, and they instructed the co-pilot to lower the landing gear, the Miami Tower Eastern just turned on final, and then the tower said, "Who else called?" And then there was a voice from the cockpit says, "Go ahead and throw them out." Drop the gear. Then another voice said, "Miami Tower, do you read Eastern 401? Just turned on to final." The tower said, "Eastern 401 heavy, continue approach to 9 left." And the other voice said, "Continue approach, roger." Shortly thereafter, the landing checklist was performed. Now, when the landing gear item was reached, the captain noticed that only the 2 main gear lights had illuminated. Stockstill, which was the co-pilot, was then asked to check the lever had been moved into the position, which he did, and then replied, "No nose gear." Captain then called the tower and informed them of the problem. "Well, tower, this is Eastern 401. Looks like we're going to have to circle. We don't have a light on our nose gear yet." Tower said, "Eastern 401 heavy, roger, pull up, climb straight ahead to 2000, go back to approach control on 128.6. Cockpit says 22 degrees, another cockpit says 22 degrees, gear up. Another cockpit voice said, "Put power on first, Bert, that a boy." Now, during the go-around, the flight engineer was troubleshooting the light to see if the problem was simply a defective bulb. The captain then instructed the first officer to engage the autopilot so that he himself could check the indicator lights. When it became apparent that jiggling the bulb was doing no good, the flight engineer was instructed to descend into the avionics bay to determine the position of the nose gear visually. The first officer continued to concentrate on the indicator light, which he now had disassembled, and was attempting to remove the bulb from. The flight engineer later emerged from the avionics bay saying that he could not determine the gear's position. Now, the crew decided that the wheel was in fact locked down, and they called for a vector back to the airport. As the first officer began the turn back to the field, he noticed that the aircraft's altitude had decreased. But the altitude light on his panel was illuminated, indicating that the autopilot was still engaged. In cockpit voice 1, "We did something to the altitude." The other pilot, "What?" First pilot, "We're still at 2000, right?" Captain, "Hey, what's happening here?" Clown, sound of a click, sound of 6 beeps, to radio, similar to the radio altimeter increasing in rate, and the sound of the impact. Now, you can look at this and say, okay, who was flying the airplane, and why did they fly into the Everglades? Well, after selecting the gear down, the light didn't illuminate. After they found out it was due to a burned out bulb. Big deal. So when they decided to fly over the Everglades to sort over the problem, the flight engineer, as we just saw, went down the belly of the airplane to see if the gear was down. Now, the autopilot started a slow descent because the pilot bumped the yoke, which sends it into pitch mode from altitude hold mode. Now, even though the warning chime went off, no one seemed to notice. They were so tunnel vision focused on this stupid light bulb that they didn't pay attention to the fact that there was some odd noise going off in the cockpit. It turns out that the captain's yoke was set for a certain amount of pressure. I think it was 15 pounds. If he put 15 pounds of pressure on the yoke, it would disconnect the autopilot. But the first officer's was set at a higher rate. Captain must have leaned against it for some reason and bumped it off. No one was looking at the instruments. At night, over a dark Everglades, no one was looking at the instruments. They were totally relying on automation to carry them through. After they bumped the autopilot off, the plane was at half its assigned altitude, and then they asked the first officer if they were still at 2,000 feet. Well, the airplane landed nicely on a nice descent in the swamp, killing 101 of the 176 on board. This was, they made a movie of it, the crash of Flight 401, and this is just what would look like, from the passenger's viewpoint, what was happening during the crash. Now, it says, could a light bulb kill you? Everybody would sit there and go, ha ha, you know, that's a joke. No, the Aeronautical decision-making rule says fly the airplane first. How many times have we heard that? They had others to solve the problem, yet no one flew the airplane or monitored the instruments. A very poor decision by the pilot in command. The task management dictates that you execute all the checklists and procedures in a manner that does not increase workload nor facilitate diversion from the task at hand. So they prioritized and decided that everybody in the cockpit was going to choose the task in hand to solve the problem. No one was assigned to fly the airplane. Such a simple thing. You need to delegate if you're in a multi-crew situation. If you're a single pilot in the same situation, your gear doesn't go down. If you put the autopilot on to try to solve the problem, cross-check. Every 30 seconds, every less than a minute, cross-check. Make sure that the autopilot is doing what you selected. Make sure if you hear a bell going off that you address what it is that's the problem. Always cross-check. Just like when you're doing an instrument scan, you need to do a diversionary scan if you're being diverted to another task. There wasn't much of a workload. The PIC should have assigned one crew member to troubleshoot and one crew member to fly the airplane. What's the big deal? They were only 2,000 feet from the ground. It's almost like the John Denver crash that we talked about in another module. He turned around to try to change tanks, but he was only 500 feet off the ground. Why do you have to divert your attention so close to the ground? Wait, give yourself altitude, or assign a crew member to do it. If you're a single pilot, tell them you want higher than 2,000 feet. Say, I got to solve this problem. Give me a little, safety. To let me go up to 3,000 or 4,000 feet and try to solve the problem. Altitude's a safety net. If we address the automation management, nobody monitored the autopilot. And there was a discrepancy of disconnect pressures. Why? These are questions that you should ask prior to having any anomaly. So you need to know before you launch if something like this is going to happen. I relate this to single pilot ops. You could easily be diverted to giving your attention to a similar malfunction. You have to know your equipment, and you have to give yourself some time to be able to sort it out. And altitude. Always fly the airplane. Divert momentarily for the problem, like we said before, then back to flying. This will also prevent you from allowing spatial disorientation to appear or a deteriorating flight condition to develop. Someone had gone from the light bulb to the attitude indicator to the altimeter to the light bulb to the attitude indicator to the altimeter. Maybe they would have caught the fact that they were in a slight descent. Set specific tasks in specific order and follow your guidelines. You could be next. Multitasking in a mechanical problem can cause a chain link breakdown. Now we want you to watch this next video scenario and see if this could be you. Now analyze that flight. Where did the breakdown in the chain begin? Think about this for a minute, then put in order the importance of the items on the following slide. Okay, poor aeronautical decision-making by the pilot. What if? What if we don't have enough fuel? Why wouldn't you add fuel as a precaution? Why would you fly with an unknown mechanical? What if this mechanical had occurred before? What if it failed when I was flying? You can ask the same question just using what if. Scheduling a trip with an early outbound and late inbound legs. Human factors. Are you going to be tired? Are you going to be hungry? Are you going to be rushed? Not communicating a potential diversion to center at the first indication of a problem. As soon as you get that problem, go ahead, tell somebody. By the time they told somebody, they couldn't get to where they wanted to go without going 50 miles in the wrong direction. Maybe they didn't have enough fuel for 50 miles. You have to communicate this as soon as the problem happens. Caving to pressure to complete the return trip. Oh well, we'll just press on. Well, suppose the whatever the malfunction was didn't really switch tanks fully. You know, maybe it's broken and something's going to happen and it's going to just shut down the fuel eventually. If you have an anomaly like that, get on the ground. Not keeping tabs on the weather. What if we have a problem and we're launching into this this weather situation? Are we going to be able to turn around? Where are our options? Figure those out before you leave. Depending on the fuel from the right tank, there's no contingency plan. Didn't you have a contingency plan? Not using his team. Okay, the team is the mechanic, weather briefer, fueler. These are your teams. These are the people that are going to help you make the flight successful. Use them. A failure to recognize his own limitations. Okay, he was fatigued. If he was fatigued, lots of times you don't have the brain power to be able to understand that maybe you're not acting with a full deck. You really have to make sure that you do the what if, and you also say to yourself, am I fit to fly? I'm safe. We've gone over that in other seminars. Now the final say, in the previous scenario, the pilot identified the problem, but seemed to be in denial about the possibility of fuel starvation because the valve was stuck. At this point, he should have assessed the risks of continuing, weighed those against his need to complete the flight, his fatigue levels, the dark night, the impending weather, and ultimately the safety of his passengers and himself. If he had started asking what if before he left the ground, maybe he wouldn't have been so surprised. There was no task management. Okay, his decision was just like in the Eastern crash, focused on the stuck valve. Didn't have a set of tasks that he had established before. Okay, suppose I have a fuel problem. What's my checklist? What's my task? What do I do next? What are my options? He never evaluated the outcome of his decision. He never explored his options. He had no procedure for the task at hand. He was sort of just winging it as he was finding out what was going on with the problem. Now, each decision we make should be followed with a possible set of outcomes. Based on those, we can make a further decision to maintain our course of action or change it. Managing a task at hand means identifying the options and organizing a set of potential solutions and outcomes, best done before you leave the ground. Now here's an acronym that the FAA uses a lot. It's to assist the pilot in remembering to successfully complete the decision-making process. By following this mental checklist, or for those of us whose minds are saturated by tasks, we can write it down and put it on our clipboard. You should be able to assess each task you do. This will give you an idea of potential outcomes based on your decision and help you to better choose a course of action. D, detect. Detect the fact that a change has occurred. Acknowledge the change, but fly the airplane. Know your equipment and recognize any mode change in a timely manner and reset to the correct mode. If you've got a GPS that's not doing what you want, if your autopilot is not doing what you want, go back to square one. If you're unable to do that, don't fixate on it. Have yourself a plan for an alternative, such as just saying, okay, we're just going to hit the direct button on the GPS and just go there, tell center, okay, we're just going to go direct because we've got a problem with the GPS, or get vectors. Always have alternatives to any situation so you can confidently apply good aeronautical decision making. E, estimate. Estimate the need to react or counter that change. Analyze any glitches in electronics, autopilot, etc., and consider the courses of action. If your workload's high, like you have turbulence or weather's bad or you're on approach, estimate how necessary it is to adjust the change immediately. As long as the airplane's flying and it's not on fire and there's no smoke in the cockpit, you have time. Addressing the problem doesn't mean you need to focus all your attention on it. Again, fly the airplane. Do some scanning. Scan to the problem, scan to the instruments. Scan to the problem, scan to the instruments. C, choose. Choose a course of action for the success of the flight. Now, one thing you want to do is reduce the workload. If you have an autopilot, turn it on. Talk to center and get a Victor. Get some help. Say, look, I got a problem here. Can you put me on vectors, keep me clear of other traffic for a while? Just, I'll be at a certain altitude and, let me see if I can work on the problem. Arrest your descent. Go around if you've got a problem on final. Sort it out at altitude. Now, once the airplane is stabilized, then use checklists and follow your task flow. And we're going to talk about a task flow in a little bit here. I is identify. Identify the actions that could implement this change. Always know your options. These are best thought out before the situation arises. That's why we keep saying, what if? Think about what if. If you've already thought about it and you already have a task flow, when you have an emergency or an anomaly, boom, you're going to be all set because you're not going to know exactly what to do. Now, prioritize what to do to fix the problem, which is called task management. If in a high workload situation, do one task at a time and then go back to monitoring the airplane. Another D is do. Follow what you just decided to do. Take the action. Adapt to the change. Once you decide on this option, please use your checklist or your task flow or automation to help reduce the workload, and always fly the airplane first. You can't fly really good if you're under stress, so try to relieve the stress and use some tools to try to do that. E, evaluate. Okay, you took an action. Did it work? Remember, you can change your mind if something's not working, but then you must implement your new task flow procedures. Always be methodical. People fly by the seat of their pants. You don't want to fly by the seat of your pants when something like this happens. You want to know exactly what to do to go to this course of action. If that doesn't work, you have to have your alternative plan that you can just insert. Always set yourself back to home base. Okay, establish the airplane in an attitude that gives you time to sort things out. And go there first. Reestablish a stable flight environment and then go back to your DECIDE acronym. But if you can't remember all that, because it's not easy to remember what the D means in the first place and the D means in the last place, just ask yourself, what if? And make up a task flow for yourself. What if? If I have a mechanical problem? What if my nav instruments went south? What if the weather's getting crummy? What if I feel dizzy? Keep asking yourself, what if, before and during the flight, and there will be no surprises. Now, the ultimate what ifs. This will at least force you to think about things as they happen or before they happen. It will help you recognize those chain links and allow you to break them before the disaster hits. It will allow you to create task flow for unexpected occurrences. This is the end of part 2. That wasn't too long, so we're going to give you another break. And you can go to part 3 and come back, and we're going to talk about one last accident. Okay, welcome back to part 3 of Aeronautical Decision Making, Task and Automation of Workload Management. Here's a sample task flow scenario that we were talking about before. Your task flow may not be exactly like ours, but the purpose of this exercise is to see the importance of having a procedure before it's needed so there are no surprises. Say you're on final at a busy towered airport with a gusty crosswind and your gear won't come down. What would you do? Pause this seminar, write down a few task management items, then come back to the next slide. Okay, here's some to-do right now task flow items. Obviously, you're going to tell somebody. Call the tower and break off the approach. Communicate the problem. Ask for vectors out of the traffic pattern to sort the problem out. If you're a non-towered airport, go someplace where you don't think you're going to be conflicting with other traffic while you divert your attention. Leave the gear handle alone and fly the airplane until you get to a safe place. If you have passengers, tell them to hold their questions. Make sure you have a sterile cockpit so you can focus on the problem. The next steps. Get established on a heading and altitude. Make sure you stabilize the airplane. If you have an autopilot, use it. Get out your checklist and address the problem. But Keep monitoring the instruments and the attitude. Back and forth and back and forth. Make sure you fly the airplane. Use decide. Communicate decision to the tower or the center once you've decided what you're going to do. Affect the plan for a gear up or a normal landing. Reduce the risk. Now choose a runway more into the wind if you have it, if they have more than one runway, or the longest available runway if you have a gear problem. Communicate to passengers what's going to happen and tell them sterile cockpit while you're on final. But above all, we've said this 100 times, fly the airplane. Now, as far as automation management checklist goes, recognize your current mode of equipment. Notice any change. If the problem happens because of something you have in the airplane, like a GPS or an autopilot, anticipate the next mode change. Okay, if you're going to have your GPS, anticipate what the next leg is or the approach procedure. If you have an autopilot, what's going to be your next altitude change. Anticipate the mode change and then go back and cross-check to make sure that your equipment did what you wanted it to do. If you have the autopilot, use it. If not, when changing GPS or selecting a procedure, cross-check. Look at your instruments, look at the GPS. Look at your instruments, look at the GPS. Do not fixate on your automation equipment. Recognize an unanticipated mode change. All right, if all of a sudden the autopilot starts, descending, you didn't want it to descend. Maybe someone hit the whiz wheel. You don't know. If the GPS starts flashing messages at you, maybe this time it's a real message. So check it out. But then promptly return the item to the correct mode if it's doing something that you don't want it to do. And all the while you have to maintain vigilance on the airplane configuration and altitude. It's not going to do you any good to have the GPS going to the right place if you're in a descending spiral going into the ground. A task saturation. Now this is an accident we're going to talk about. It's a Canada Transportation Safety Board determined that the task saturation, workload mismanagement, fatigue, and poor aeronautical decision-making contributed to spatial disorientation and a collision with the sea. We're going to go into this, and what you can say is that, okay, could this be me? Could I have done that? All right, it was a twin-engine airplane, right, and they had two pilots on board. One was a PIC, one was an owner. The owner didn't have enough time in the airplane, so they had to hire a PIC. Well, guess what? The PIC didn't have any time in the airplane either. They both airlined from Calgary the day of the flight, so they were already tired because they came from Calgary to the East Coast to Ontario. The PIC, who was the hired pilot, only had an hour and a half hours of training that day. So here he's flown all the way from Calgary. Now all of a sudden he gets in the airplane. It's a very hot day, so he's sweating and probably dehydrated, and he gets a quick check out in the airplane. But he wasn't familiar with the GPS, and neither was the owner. The PIC also told the owner he didn't like flying at night or in bad weather, especially in an unfamiliar airplane that you just got checked out in. But they decided to press on. What if? Did they ask? Probably not. They launched, and everything was going fine until they got near Sydney, Nova Scotia. Now that was their destination, and it was nighttime. The weather here at Sydney, if you look at the approach, we've got this little approach here. They were going to go out here, and they were going to come in on the approach from the ocean. Here's the ocean out here. So they had to come out, and they had to intercept the track inbound. Weather was 700 broken. Look at minimums. Okay, if they have the LNAV, they have the VNAV. I don't know if they had that in there, but anyway, they're close to minimums. So they're not going to see much until they, get close. But then they won't even say anything anyway because the sea is dark and it's a sort of a miserable night. Although, look at the visibility. 12 statute miles. They're probably going to be able to see some lights when they broke out. The wind was not very significant, 200 degrees at 8, but the time was almost midnight. They're doing this RNAV 25 over dark ocean. So here's what happened. The cockpit conditions, the pilots were tired. Again, they were unfamiliar with the GPS. They're not happy at night or low IFR. They're not familiar with the aircraft. They had pressure to get there for a meeting. They're landing at a strange airport, and both of them had low multi-engine time. Obviously, you can sit there and go, yeah, right, why would these guys do this? How many times have all of us cut the corners and done something that was equally as risky, but we didn't even think it was risky? These guys just figured, okay, so we're tired. People go and fly all the time when they're tired. They never think anything of it. They figured, okay, maybe it wasn't going to be that bad. The big thing that should have alerted them was the fact that the weather wasn't going to be good when they got there, and they weren't really up to speed on the GPS and all the other electronics in the airplane. Okay, here's what happened. Air traffic issued a hold due to the traffic. So they said you can't land now. They had to go out and do a hold. Well, the pilots were told to slow down to avoid holding, because obviously they said we don't want to hold, but okay, so slow down. But they didn't slow down. And center came back and said, would you slow down? And they didn't respond. This is where fatigue is setting in. Somehow it's not computing between their ears and their brain. The aircraft was told to turn right. They turned left. The aircraft was offered vectors by center, and they said, no, we got it. Why would you not want to reduce your workload? Aircraft was told to descend, and they didn't. So the aircraft then, they answered approach with a different tail number. So now you can see they're starting to get behind the 8 ball really bad. And if you see yourself in a situation like this, and hopefully you will have enough presence of mind because of these seminars to realize that fatigue can make you think like everything's hunky-dory and you don't have to worry about it. Even if that happens, ask for assistance. Say, look, I'm tired. Could you give me vectors? Could you, yell at me if my altitude's up? Anything to do. I mean, Sydney, Nova Scotia is not like JFK. They're going to be able to talk to you. The aircraft flew through the approach track and then tried to capture it in a steep turn and then disappeared from radar. Here's what it looked like. All right. They, there was obviously, you can see that they're starting to turn back at this point here, and then they lost it and they ended up doing a steep spiral and crashing in the ocean. But this accident never should have happened. They should have said, what if, all the way out there, and said, maybe, what if we're tired? Okay, maybe we don't have to get there tomorrow. Maybe we can go the next day. What if the weather's going to be bad? Maybe we can see if the weather's going to be at a different airport and we can land short of our destination and go in the morning. There's all these alternatives you can do. The big thing you have to say to yourself is, what if I'm too tired to handle this? That's the big thing. Ego will get in the way and say, oh yeah, we can handle this. What if you're too tired to handle that? You have to be very, very conscious of your own self and your own ability, because you are the last cog in the wheel. The airplane isn't going to land unless you tell it to do the right things. So we can think of the chain of errors. Like we just said, these are aeronautical decision-making errors. Fatigue, low experience, late departure, unfamiliar airport, unfamiliar GPS, unfamiliar aircraft, never worked as a crew before. Here's a chain of events. Any one of those chain of events, you might have been able to change the outcome. You have to look at this. You have to think of this before you take off. Ask yourself what could have been done to break this chain. Okay? Think about it. Think about you. If any flight that you have taken that's similar to this, have you been tired? Have you been rushed? Have you gone into a mountain airport that you've never been in before? Is it going to be dark there? Are you really familiar with your GPS? If you have a GPS, ask yourself all of these questions over and over. The human factors, here's the human factors error: fatigue. That's the big error. Most likely malnourished and dehydrated because the training in the day's temperature was 86 degrees Fahrenheit. They were stressed and they had get-there-itis. Task saturation. The contributing factors was darkness, unfamiliarity with the airplane, GPS, no task flow plan or crew coordination. Are you discussing the approach? Is there somebody in the right seat, if you have someone in the right seat that's a pilot, that's bopping you on the head saying, hey, you know, let's do this, let's do that, let's get vectors, let's get help, you know, something like that. Make it easy. I'm tired, I want to go to bed. Let's make it easy for us. You know, you can always ask for help. The conscious brain processes focal vision. Okay, they read the instruments and fly the aircraft. Now, this is in the absence of having any horizon or other visual cues, but this leads to neural breakdown and processing information. That is called task saturation. Simple tasks such as reprogramming the GPS would have been difficult and may have taken attention away from flying for several minutes. Now, you don't know if who was flying the airplane at this point. You don't know if they were even talking to each other. Maybe somebody was sleeping. You don't know that. But if you're in the airplane by yourself in this situation, use your tools. Talk to people. Get help. Get assistance. There's no shame in that. Now, obviously, they had a loss of situational awareness. Finding knobs and switches in a dark, unfamiliar aircraft while maneuvering is hazardous to your health. Right? If you don't know that airplane cold and it's dark and unfamiliar, and now you're in pressure because you know the weather's down, and you know you have no horizon, nothing to look at, it's going to take your attention away, and it's also going to give you spatial disorientation. Especially if you program the GPS, they were correcting for a missed intercept. Okay, so now they had to turn the GPS around. They had to do whatever they had to do in order to get it to go and get the magenta line going the right direction. Now, stress and fatigue, they all raise the potential for unrecognized spatial disorientation. And the assumption was that they lost it and did a spiral dive into the ocean. That's what the assumption was because of what happened. Don't let this be you. You can look at this situation, you can put yourself in a similar situation and make sure that you know that you've done your homework beforehand and that you have the guts to either cancel the flight or make a diversion somewhere before you get in this kind of situation. Besides the obvious to continue on the flight into deteriorating conditions and into an unfamiliar aircraft, the pilots made one final bad decision: to decline the vectors. Get yourself help. Reduce your workload. It's okay. It's not, like I said, it's not embarrassing to ask for help. And most likely the fatigue levels they were experiencing incapacitated their thought process. So they really weren't able to make this safe aeronautical decision. Now, by reviewing the scenario, you can apply all that we've talked about in all of our SPRM classes. And hopefully you will take this information seriously and fly professionally with all the procedures that we outlined as your guide.